Hello, everybody. My name is Nandita Baruah. I'm the country representative of the Asia Foundation, and I'm really pleased to be here to provide some insights to this very interesting topic on G20 under India's presidency and its impact on foreign policy. And I'm going to be addressing this, of course, more broadly on the issue, but also more specifically from the perspective of what would it mean from a gendered or a feminist foreign policy lens. What opportunities does it open up for India in the current context? I'd like to thank IMPRI for giving me this opportunity, and I'm sorry that I'm not able to do this in person, but I hope that any further questions or any clarifications that the participants who are listening in on this lecture may have would be forwarded to me, and I hope to be able to answer them to the best that I can. So jumping straight into the topic, I think we are today at as the world is watching us. India is playing a very critical role in its capacity having taken over the presidency of the G20. Now, if we are to ask this question as to how is India going to take this opportunity and what would it mean, not just for India, but for the world as a whole, what perspectives, what thinking can India put forward? I'm going to begin by just going back to that one critical sentence that the Prime Minister made in Bali when we took over the presidency, and he said, "One Earth, one family, one future." And he emphasized on equitable growth and a shared future. I think, to me, that probably is the most critical, underlying vision for India's presidency in the G20. And equitable growth and shared future are critical. So that should be the driving force. Now, having said that, at the time when India took over the presidency, the world was facing a lot of crisis. We were coming out of COVID. We were seeing the economies of the global South and the global North fluctuating at different levels. However, I think at that point, one didn't see that there will be additional crisis at the global arena added to what we were already facing. And that turned out to be the war that, broke out between Ukraine and Russia. So navigating the G20 in light of this global polarization, the conflict, of course, of the, developed North with counterparts in South, China being the main center stage, the conflict currently within Russia and Ukraine, and polarization of, choices that other countries are making around this. All of this has created much larger challenges today as India navigates this G20 partnership. And it's becoming more challenging for us as a country to really focus on the earlier vision, which is equitable growth and shared future. Clearly, shared future at this point in the world doesn't seem to be having a shared framework. And I think that is where India is going to have to navigate its presidency. I think even as I look at it, I do want to go back saying, yes, world leaders are grappling with, what is the global stand going to be on Ukraine? While, we can swing one way or the other on how legitimate the war is, who started it, all those questions. But two key questions remain, irrespective of where you stand on the war. There is no denying that the impact on people of both the countries have been immense, on women, on children, on girls, on young men and boys. And I think that any war, the one thing that I think we all know is that the displacement, the dislocation, the loss of opportunities, resources, cuts across both parties who are at war. It's not, it doesn't impact one or the other. And that also creates larger humanitarian crises. In this case, of course, it's about, the safety and the security of, let's just say, those impacted by the war on both sides of the border. And I think while we may, again, this was at the I think the foreign ministers meet, the G20 foreign ministers meet, I think the Prime Minister said something very interesting. He said, instead of focusing, while we may have a lot of disagreements on issues, we need to focus on what we agree on and what we can move forward on. And I do think that as India stands in this position today, it's critical how we frame the discourse around equity and inclusion, even in the most conflicts driven, most challenging situations that the world may face. I think on issues where we look at what should the world stand be when it comes to protecting, when it comes to providing, opportunities, resources, in a more equitable manner to the most affected, there should be a common framing on that. That brings me to the next point, where I think, what is it that we are looking at? We are looking at, multilateral bodies and multilateralism to be defined in a much better way than it is today. We have seen the failure of multilateral bodies repeatedly, and I think I don't necessarily need to go into that. But then the question is, what is the multilateralism that India can help define at this point? Where do we stand in our perspective of being able to give, be the bridge between both the developed and the developing world, by looking at some of the multilateral institutions who ought to be doing this better than they are doing. And framing that discourse is also going to be critical to the G20 presidency of India. And I think India is focusing on that. And it is a sectoral thing. It's not like, it's not a singular box that we can club multilateralism into, but multilateral institutes work across sectors, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's access to resources, climate, renewable energy. But across these sectors, the one, I think, underlying, focus, or the one underlying commonality should be on how do you unpack this in a more equitable, more gender sensitive, more diverse access manner. Globally, we know that, whether we look at the developed North or the developing South, people who are at the margins, at the fringes, are they're everywhere. Whether we are looking at people, we are looking at women who, of course, are globally face different levels of inequity and marginalization. We look at communities, ethnic minority groups, sexual minorities. These groups have remained and continue to be in the fringes. The women's movement, of course, has made more gains. And today, at least in some of our countries, we have had greater success, but it's still not a full success. It's still a long way to go. So we have to keep pushing the boundaries and the borders of bringing these groups who are on the margins, on the sidelines, into the mainstream of that equitable growth and the equitable and shared future that we are talking about. It cannot be shared if more than 50% are not a part of that discourse. So I feel that for India, bringing that discourse is going to be key, and we are seeing some of it. And it's becoming more and more difficult with the growing polarization, because then the focus then tends to shift to the issues which are polarizing, which is whether a war is valid or not, whether, the origin of COVID needs to be debated or not, whether the economic, push factors that are happening between the North and the South are being driven by a country or not. Those are, while those debates remain and will take much longer to resolve, those debates also need to underpin the absolute need for having this more equitable and inclusive framework. None of those debates will reach any kind of viable conclusion if it is minus that lens of having all voices at the center of these discourses. I also feel that when we look at India, and I think, the Asia Foundation, along with some of our other partners, we have been talking about having this space for a feminist foreign policy. And I recognize the fact that currently within India, there is an interest and an appetite to really unpack this in a more structured and sectoral manner as to what would it mean if we are to start applying a feminist lens to our foreign policy. And all of what I just said is a discourse that is leading to how India takes its stand on foreign policy, not just vis-a-vis us as a country, but also creating a framework for the world at large. So coming back to this framing of a feminist foreign policy, I think we see it as a three level, inference. First, of course, understanding what it means when we say a feminist foreign policy. Um, I want to start by saying, and I always think it becomes so important to say, a feminist foreign policy, the basic premise is inclusion. It's not exclusion at the cost of A or B. It doesn't really, it's not talking about saying, oh, we need to have, larger uh, space for women. What it is talking is we need to have a more concrete, a more defined discourse on how our actions outside our borders get defined by what we are doing inside the nation, and how those actions then impact on all marginalized communities, people uh, in the in the in the countries that we are talking to, or in this set of countries, or in the coalitions of nation states that we are discussing the issue about. So let's start with, say, health, because health still remains something critical. We're just about recovering from COVID, but not yet there. And we are seeing multiple other challenges. The question is, in moving forward, how do global alliances, multi-country alliances, or multilateral bodies define what a global health framework should look like? I think somewhere down the line we have really lost track of getting that framework to be equitable. We have been drawn into the politics of health rather than the equity or the equality of health services and right to good health globally. And so what would that mean? I think, to me, it would mean is how much is the world going to invest on, first, health research that doesn't look at very, very micro challenges, but looks at global health pandemic issues, and looks at it from the point of view of less developed countries and their needs as critical, and the developed nation and their role to support the less developed country in building and health infrastructure or a health system that will bring them at par, to those who are better off in their health access and services. Second is looking at, so the structure itself is one, and to me, that is a critical part of a feminist foreign policy discourse. If you're looking at health as a sector, to say, how are we as countries, how are we as either the Quad or the BIMSTEC or the ASEAN, the SAARC, the G20, going to define this framework where we look at the structural needs of countries to deliver equitable health. And we saw how countries with very weak, poor structures suffered when a global pandemic hit. And I think it was unfair that the developed world, was equally affected, but had at least the structures in place to deal with it, whereas a lot of the less developing countries, economically weaker countries, really had to, deal with it with minimal resources till other countries decided to step in. And I think to that effect, I would say India really did play a human's role in being first off the block to even share vaccines. You look at access to vaccines and wastage of vaccines between the African nations and the global developed nations of the North, I think it's criminal. You have an entire part of the globe who couldn't even access vaccines. And there was another part of the world, the well-off countries in the Northern Hemisphere, who ended up destroying vaccines because they were not used. And I think not discussing that as a part of the framework going forward on health is going to be highly unjust. The second issue is, even in terms of health research, I hope that this pandemic becomes a learning for us as a world to say, what is an impact of a global health disaster? Is it same for all, or does it have a differential impact? Does it impact women more indifferently, children, people with disabilities, people with comorbidities, people with less nutritional status or weaker nutritional status? Health research needs to be driven by the needs of those who have less, not by the needs of those who have more or those who have it. And so I think, again, that's where the focus, when we say what's a feminist foreign policy going to look on health, to me, that's the second thing. It is about getting that framing where we say, we are dealing with an issue which is critical to the world, but we cannot deal with it unless we drive our investments to make sure that it allows for the least privilege to have the maximum privilege, and therefore bringing them to equity, So I think that's, to me, is the other second pillar of having the structure in place, having the research in space. The third is really ensuring that there is equity in distribution of any support that is needed, whether it's medical support, it's access to health service providers, caregivers, and there is a huge investment that's needed there. One, to create those caregivers, to create those health service sector service providers, from doctors to frontline caregivers to nurses. And I think investing in that part more equitably across, not just globally, but this also within our own nation states, within our own countries, is something that's important. Interestingly, I think if we look at India, one of the reasons that despite all the challenges, I think India still managed to do a fairly decent job of dealing with COVID was because we had these frontline service workers whom we pulled in when COVID happened, whether it's the Asha Didi, the Anganwadi worker. And I think it's a huge credit to them that we were able to reach almost the last mile. I would say, we worked in Jharkhand during that time, we as an organization and in UP. And I can tell you that without these frontline service providers, we probably would have not been able to reach 30 to 35% of the population in these very, very remote districts of India. And, thanks to them, that they deserve an accolade. And so what is the lesson learned? Maybe as a world order, maybe as multilateral agencies which work on health, we need to be able to invest and identify and create and support these kind of last mile connectivity through human and structural access across the world. Because, COVID has just happened, but I guess given all the challenges of climate and environment and all the mutations we are facing, we're probably going to say, I don't want to be a doomsayer, but I think we're probably going to see more severe pandemics which impact the world collectively rather than in segments. Also because we are more connected in terms of, as a world today, in movement of people and goods. So I think keeping that in mind. So to me, if I say feminist foreign policy, health, here is what I would like to unpack it. And I would want people to understand that this is what we are trying to push for. And I think for India, given some of our successes at home, structures and lessons learned the hard way as well, probably it's a leadership role we can play in defining a feminist health perspective going forward. And that's just one sector. There are multiple. There is trade. There is digital health in India, in which India is taking a lead role. Solar and renewable energy. I think if we are disaster risk reduction, if we are to break these up sectorally, and it's going to take me more time than I have to do that. And I think that's where I feel a clear vision and definition of what a feminist foreign policy could be can be put forward by India. And I think G20 provides us this opportunity, and the platform, the presidency provides us this opportunity and platform to do that, and really take to the center stage the statement that the Prime Minister made on emphasizing equitable growth and shared future. So yes, one Earth, one family, one future requires a common vision, a common vision on issues of access, rights, and equity, on issues of marginalized communities and people, on issues related to equitable sharing between the developed and the developing world. The second thing I do want to say is that, a lot of conversation happens around these are the difference between what people tend to define as soft and hard issues. And I prefer not to really get into that, because I think to me, the health sector needs or the disaster risk reduction is as much a hard issue as a debate or a discourse on arms and war and border security. So I think unpacking that framing, that it's not, the world cannot divide itself in addressing issues saying, oh, these are hard issues, so it requires more of our time, attention, and resources, and these are soft issues and they are important, but, and that but becomes a problem from where I'm looking at this whole issue. The other thing, of course, is for us to be able to look at a larger just trying to frame it, the larger context of where the investments and the gains have been in the world that the women's movement has created, and collectively, I think the women's movement has made a lot of progress. And I feel that sometimes we tend to lose focus of those gains as we design new strategies and new thinking. Let's talk about peace processes, for example. The world has not been in conflict in a new way. We've been in conflict globally, in African countries, in the MENA region, in South Asia itself, in the neighborhood within South Asia, and in all the conflicts that the world has seen at large. I feel that the perspective of gender just gets left behind when at both levels. At first, the impact of the conflict on women and marginalized communities never comes forward. It just comes almost usually as an afterthought, saying, oh, we now need to look at them. It doesn't become the theme of the peace negotiations or the peace processes almost ever, and I think that not having that at the center stage is going to be a challenge. We are in conflict globally across the world in many stages in the arena. We're going to see more conflicts, I'm assuming, given that we are getting more and more polarized. And while we try to reduce the polarization, we also have to focus at, are we putting gender at the center stage of resolving conflicts and on the table when peace processes are being discussed, And what sometimes is annoying is to see that, you tend to think if you bring in 2 or 3 or 4 women to the table in a peace process, you tend to think that you have addressed gender, which really, we all know that's not the case. What is important is to see that in the negotiation of this peace process, are all the harms or the inequity faced by women and marginalized communities being addressed going forward? If not, you are leaving things to ferment and blow up again, maybe 5, 10, 15 years down the line. Not addressing these diverse inequities and differential impact does not mean that they are just going to go away because you have negotiated some sort of a peace process. We've seen that in the case of Afghanistan, the very fact when, the initial phases when Taliban was overthrown and, attempt to set up democratic governance was put in place, the core issues of control and marginalization of 50% of the population was talked but didn't get addressed effectively, and which is why today we are exactly in the same space we were in Afghanistan vis-a-vis gender issues and gender rights. And it is flowing beyond the borders of Afghanistan. And I'm just giving Afghanistan as an example, but we are seeing what's happening across, the MENA region and other places. So I think peace process, peace negotiations, to me is the other area where a framing of a clearly defined, equitable, gender responsive understanding is something that would be essential for a country like India to have a say and have a role in. Also, because I think we need to learn in India from the internal conflicts that we have seen, within our borders. And I think we have learned some lessons from it. We've tried to address those conflicts and these changes, across the country, across the states in India, including trying to mainstream people who became a part of a conflict because they felt marginalized in the first place, and then bringing them into to be at the center stage of the national development framework. And those are lessons that I think we should boldly and more aggressively take forward in the global stage, to be discussed and put forward as things that the world as a whole and multilateral agencies definitely need to have a say in and work towards. So I feel that, therefore, I think, for me, the feminist foreign policy lens is not a narrow lens between soft and hard issues. It's about a perspective building that hinges on true belief in equity. It's a perspective that hinges on our understanding of what causes marginalization in the first place, and therefore what is required to deal with that marginalization, and to deal with it not by countering it with another layer of inequity, but to deal with it by really actually erasing the basis of the inequity itself. And I know that people will say, well, that means patriarchy. Well, yes, that means patriarchy. And honestly, I don't believe that it's so hard to get rid of patriarchy if you want to. I think the challenge is, do we want to? After all, we have, collectively as a world come to a point where this issue has been raised and debated and contested. It's a perspective thing. Are the people who think they are in control and power, can they be brought to the table to say, your control and power is not effective because it doesn't take into consideration those who don't have it? Any control and power which hinges on the framing of really not recognizing that your control and power is at the cost of undermining somebody is not effective use of power. I am not saying that there is no going to be power hierarchy. There always will be, but the power hierarchy needs really to be cognizant of the understanding that the hierarchy cannot create more inequity. The hierarchy, it should be something that you use to enable equity. So those debates, I think those understanding and philosophical guidance is something I feel very clearly that, as a country, India should be at the forefront of defining. It's not going to happen overnight, but, it's an opportunity for us to say, what is it that we would like to put forward to the world in the understanding. So having taken two areas, which is, whether you say health and you want to call it a soft or a hard issue, and peace and power, I just think that these are framings that require a much deeper discourse and a kind of a better analytical positioning that can be provided by us, and utilizing the G20 presidency to create that voice and to create that framing is an opportunity. It is more needed today, given the challenges we are facing. What you don't want is the polarization to create larger divides between a global South and a global North. What the global South's voice should be today is to correct the inequitable framing of the world that the global North has pursued for years now. And I think that is the time for all of us to come together and start questioning where things, got played out in a way that patriarchy actually also translated to relationships between nation states. So challenging that becomes the key. The power dynamics will be something critical. That's also going to define how we look at areas of our different sectoral work across the globe. And I feel that this is the opportunity for India to cash into. And I think in India, at least, I feel that the conversation when we started on feminist foreign policy was a little hesitant to begin with in the acceptance of the different institutions and the government structures. But today I feel that there's a much larger opening to really unpack this, and I'd like us to be able to take advantage of that and be able to provide a more clearer roadmap for India to really encash on the one earth, one family, and one future vision that the Prime Minister put forward when he took over the presidency of the G20. So I'll stop here. Thank you.